The 20th of December 1995 was a lovely day at Miami International Airport in the United States. Passengers were hurrying between the gates, many starting their holiday travel early, hoping to get some extra time at home with their loved ones. And at around 15:40 that afternoon, a crew from American Airlines met up in the terminal and started preparing for their coming evening duty, Flight 965 down towards Cali in Colombia. Most of the 155 passengers that were booked on this flight were Colombian Americans, going back home for Christmas, and that was also the case for some of the 6 flight attendants. Now, in command of the flight was a 57-year-old captain with over 13,000 hours of total time, which included 2,260 hours on the 75 and 767, who share a common type rating. He was a decorated ex-Air Force pilot who had been awarded the Flying Cross for his bravery during the Vietnam War, before retiring from the military in 1969 to start a 26-year-long career with American Airlines. His colleague on the flight deck was a 39-year-old first officer with 5,800 hours in total, including a very respectable 2,286 on the 75 and 767. He was also a former Air Force pilot who had served as a flight instructor, and in that role his exemplary performance had earned him the title of Instructor of the Year back in 1985. Now, neither of these 2 pilots had any history of training problems, and their friends and colleagues all described them in glowing terms, like very competent, professional pilots and excellent communicators. Both of them had also come up through American Airlines' world-class training program, which included the very latest advances in crew resource management, human factors, upset recovery procedures, and so on. Now, they were both based in American Airlines' Miami base, which was where the company positioned its flight crews for services down to Latin America. You see, all American Airlines pilots who was going to serve destinations in Central and South America had to undergo special training on the unique operational aspects of flying there, as well as the differences this could bring compared to operations within the United States. This included a reference guide which outlined these unique hazards and operational requirements, as well as specific ground school, covering topics including the increased importance of terrain awareness and the lack of certain air traffic control capabilities. It also highlighted the terrain hazards in South America that could be worse and more extensive than anything that these pilots would have previously encountered, while at the same time the radar coverage could be limited or even non-existent. On top of this, the air traffic controllers might not be able to assist with some issues due to limited English language abilities, or just different local practices and procedures. And the destination that this crew were now about to operate into was a great example of some of these difficulties. Cali's Alfonso Bonilla Aragon International Airport is situated in a very long narrow valley oriented north to south with high mountains on both sides, some of which reach elevations well above 13,000 feet. At the time of this flight, the control tower there was also not equipped with radar, since that system had reportedly been destroyed by rebels back in 1992. Now, the captain was certainly aware of this, since he had flown to Cali 13 times before, but it was going to be the first officer's first time there, so he was now looking to the captain for guidance on what to expect. But of course, none of that would matter if they couldn't get off the ground first. The departure that was originally scheduled for 16:40 soon ended up being delayed by over half an hour in order to allow passengers from connecting flights that had been affected by the really bad winter weather in the US to be able to arrive. This was especially true for flights from New York, where earlier on that same day, a Tower Air Boeing 747 had skidded off an icy runway at JFK, causing significant delays from there. So while they waited, the pilots continued reviewing their dispatch paperwork, and it showed that the Boeing 757 that they were going to operate was in perfect working order. There also seemed to be no significant weather en route, except for some light rain showers and scattered to broken overcast clouds at 2,000 and 10,000 feet near Cali, and all the NOTAMs and other information looked perfectly okay. So, at time 17:14, all the passengers had finally arrived and they were cleared for pushback. But before they could then taxi to the departure runway, they were hit with further ground delays due to the heavy outbound traffic. And that lasted a full hour and 21 minutes. Which meant that Flight 965 was finally cleared for takeoff at time 18:35. And that delay would have its consequences. Now, the takeoff itself was completely normal, with the first officer as pilot flying and the captain as pilot monitoring. The magnificent Boeing 757 soon climbed uneventfully up towards its cruising altitude, while the passengers in the back settled in for the just over 3-hour-long flight down towards Cali. The cruise phase then also passed without anything noteworthy happening. The flight crossed over Cuba, then the Caribbean Sea, and finally into Colombian airspace, where the pilots made contact with the air traffic controllers in Barranquilla and later Bogotá. Now, the cockpit voice recording began at time 21:19, while Flight 965 was still cruising in Bogotá airspace. And at that time, the pilots were discussing the duty and rest time requirements for the cabin crew. You see, with that almost 2-hour departure delay that they had incurred, it looked like it might not be enough time for the flight attendants to get their required rests before operating the outbound flight the following morning. If that was the case, well, then the outbound flight would have to be delayed, which the two pilots wanted to minimize or avoid if possible. This kind of issues is something that we have to deal with a lot when there are long delays, and it's easy to forget that things like this can exert subconscious pressures on pilots to hurry things along. Now, that is of course a threat in itself, but especially in more complicated environments where small mistakes can lead to big consequences. One of the most common things that these kind of pressures can lead to is something known as get-there-itis, which is basically a strong desire to get to the destination and to be done as quickly as possible. And that's even if the circumstances might indicate that that would not be the best course of action. So it can ultimately lead to bad decisions and corner cutting if you're not aware of it, and it's especially important to look out for this as a pilot monitoring and as a first officer, as it tends to hit the flying pilot more often, and especially if that is also the captain. Now, even with modern threat and error management training, which teaches us to identify this kind of pressure and take steps to mitigate it, it can be hard to slow down and take your time. That's just a very human thing. Having said that though, at this point, the pilots had no reason to rush. But it's still worth remembering that this rest time issue was looming over them. Anyway, at time 21:23, the captain said to the first officer, "When you want to send, let me know a few minutes early in case there is a language problem." Which clearly showed that he was indeed thinking ahead and was fully aware that the controller's limited English and his own limited Spanish could lead to some issues. Of course, all controllers and pilots who operate international traffic are required to speak aviation English, but if they haven't studied the language beyond the bare minimum, well, then they might not be able to communicate outside of the standard phraseologies, which can cause issues if something doesn't go according to plan. And this captain probably knew that this could happen on this particular route since he had already flown it many times before. The first officer acknowledged the captain's request, and then they just continued chatting about work, schedules and so on. Standard stuff that we pilots always tend to debate in crews when the workload is light. Having said that though, at this point the pilots had no real reason to rush, but it is still worth remembering that this rest time issue was looming over them. And when we're on the subject of things that can cause stress, when you are out traveling these coming holidays, you shouldn't be worrying over connectivity or confusing local SIM cards. That's if you use today's sponsor, Holafly, which makes staying connected easier than ever before. With their new Holafly Plans monthly subscriptions, they have become the world's first truly international mobile operator, providing coverage in over 160 different countries and all under one eSIM and subscription. You can pick between two different options. The 25GB Lite plan, which is great for staying in touch, browsing social media and sharing photos, or the Unlimited plan for heavier data use like video calls and streaming. Both plans include hotspot and auto-renew monthly, so you're never without service. With the unlimited plan, you can also get a local phone number in some destinations to receive SMS, which is a great thing for verification purposes. And when you run back home, you can cancel your subscription at any time and then just reactivate it again for your next trip. On top of all of that, Holofly plans now also includes a safety feature called Always On, which activates once you cancel your monthly plan. And this awesome feature provides you with 1 GB of completely free data every month in over 70 destinations, which is perfect for unexpected layovers or urgent situations and just adds that level of calm. I've actually never seen anything like it. So to get your Holofly plan's eSIM, just make an account, choose your plan, and your eSIM will arrive to your email almost instantly. But make sure that you use this QR code or go to esim.holofly.com/plans for a 10% discount when you use the code Mentour at checkout. Thank you, Holofly. Now let's get back to the story. A couple of minutes later, the first officer noticed that they were 136 miles away from the Cali VOR radio beacon, so with 32,000 feet to descend, he told the captain that they might as well start going down. Said and done, the captain requested descent from Bogota area control, and controller initially cleared them to descend down to 24,000 feet. Now, whilst the first officer started the descent, the captain made a routine call to the American Airlines Operations Center in Cali to let them know about their estimated time of arrival and also to find out which gate that they could expect. That's another thing that we always tend to do when we have some extra time, because knowing the gate often gives us a good idea of the taxi routing that we can then expect later on. The operations controller greeted the captain, gave him the information and confirmed that the weather in Cali was good, and he then also provided the altimeter setting, which the pilots noted down. After that, the captain made a PA announcement to the passengers containing very standard stuff like their arrival time and weather and so on, but he also gave them a brief apology for the delays back in Miami. Meanwhile, at time 21:31, the autopilot started leveling the aircraft off at their cleared 24,000 feet, so the captain now reported to Bogota that they requested lower. The controller replied back with a further clearance down to 20,000 feet, and he then told them to contact Cali approach, which the captain correctly read back. Now at this point, I want to go over the approach procedures for Cali, because they're soon going to become very important. The cockpit voice recorder didn't capture the pilot's approach briefing, but evidence shows that they had briefed for an instrument landing system or ILS approach into runway 01. That runway is used when approaching Cali from the south, whilst runway 19 is used from the north, but out of those two, only runway 01 had an ILS, and which one would be used would be determined obviously based on prevailing winds, visibility and traffic. Now, when coming from the north, as this flight was, in order to land on runway 01, they would be required to first fly to the Cali VOR, known as CLO, located 7.5 nautical miles south of the airport. After that, they would then need to turn around to intercept the ILS localizer and glide slope, which would finally guide the aircraft down towards the runway. But prior to reaching the Cali VOR, the pilots would also need to adhere to one of the published Standard Terminal Arrival Routes, or STARs, in order to keep them clear of terrain and for their maneuvering to be predictable for the non-radar equipped controllers. Now, whilst STARs are used almost everywhere, they are especially important at airports like Cali, where there is both very high terrain around and the controllers can't see where the aircraft are because they don't have radar. And actually, for this reason, the flight plan for Flight 965 had a note that explicitly told the crew to maintain strict adherence to the STAR. Now, back then, the applicable STAR would have been the Rosso 1 arrival, which started from a VOR beacon called Tulua, or Uniform Lima, Quebec, located about 41 miles north-northeast of the Cali VOR. It then proceeded to the Cali VOR via a non-directional beacon called Rosso, located just a couple of miles north of the runway. Now, when flying this STAR, it was standard practice to report when passing Tulua and Rosso to give the controller a picture of the airplane's progress through the procedure. Remember that. Anyway, after the pilots had made contact with Cali approach and reported their position, the controller said, Cleared to the Cali VOR. Descend and maintain 15,000 feet. No delay expected for approach. Report to Lua VOR. What he meant here was that there was no traffic between their position and the Cali VOR, so they were cleared to proceed all the way through the star. But when the captain read this back, he said, "Clear direct to Cali VOR. Report to Lua. Altitude 15." This meant that a misunderstanding had now occurred, because the controller hadn't used the word direct at all, and this would soon come to have big consequences. You see, when a controller clears you direct to a fix, that means that you can fly directly from your current position to that fix in a straight line, which is common practice in radar-controlled airspace like you'll find in, for example, the United States. But in a non-radar airspace, like the one around Cali, the controller would rarely clear a flight to depart from the star like that, since he only knew where the plane was if they were following the published procedure. And that's especially true when there is also a lot of high terrain around. That was why he had told the pilot to report to Lua, which was the first point on the standard arrival route. But the American captain, who was likely predisposed to the practices of American air traffic controllers, interpreted cleared to Cali VOR as a direct-to clearance, since that was what he was used to hearing. Now, since he had undergone the training on Latin American ATC procedures and also had flown to Cali many times before, the captain ideally should have known that the controller here wouldn't issue a direct clearance like that. But sometimes the brain just fits information into a preconceived pattern without you even being aware of it. So I think that was probably what happened here. And with that in mind, the captain decided to program this new clearance into the flight management system, which means that we now need to dive into that system and how it works, because it's going to be super important for what's about to happen. The Boeing 757 is equipped with a programmable flight management system, or FMS, that the pilots can use to enter waypoints, approaches, or even entire flight plans into. To do this, the pilots have an interface unit, known as the CDU, or Control and Displays Unit, which often sits near the pilot's knees and looks like a little computer, and from where the inputs goes to the flight management computer, or the FMC. Now, this system can be used to tell the autopilot what to do and effectively guide the airplane automatically through an entire flight, both vertically and horizontally. The FMS on board this 757 used a rudimentary form of GPS to determine the airplane's own position, which could then be compared against the coordinates of navigational aids and other waypoints stored in the system's memory. But one thing that I want to make absolutely clear here is that the satellite navigation capability, especially the way that it was displayed, was quite primitive on this 757. It was nothing like the detailed moving maps where we have terrain displays, etc. that you will see today. Instead, the pilot's navigational display just showed the position of the aircraft together with any programmed waypoints on a black background, with a magenta line showing the programmed track to follow. Now, if the pilot selected a new waypoint or procedure from the database to fly to, the display would then show a dashed white line depicting that new planned route. And if the pilots then verified that this route was indeed correct, well, then they could press execute, and the dashed line would then be replaced by a solid magenta line instead, indicating that the selection was now active. And then, by selecting the autopilot's lateral mode to LNAV, the autopilot would start following that magenta line. Now, in this particular case, the FMS was already loaded with the full flight plan, including the Rosso 1 arrival into Cali via the Tulua and Rosso beacons. But when the captain thought that he heard that they were cleared direct to Cali, he told the first officer that he would give him direct Cali in the FMC. So he line selected the Cali VOR and pressed the Direct To button on his CDU, which immediately eliminated all the other waypoints between the aircraft position and the Cali VOR. And that meant that Tulua and Rosso now disappeared from the navigational display. And that was a problem, since the controller had just asked them to report Tulua. Now, the FMS on this aircraft had been designed to display only active waypoints. But in situations like this, that feature was not great. Now, Boeing was aware of this, and by the time of this story, they had actually already updated the logic to continue displaying previously selected waypoints as, I guess, a beam point after pressing Direct To. But that improvement was only applied to newly built 757s, meaning that it was never added to this particular aircraft. Anyway, neither pilots immediately noticed that this would become a problem. Instead, the first officer just asked the captain whether the speed limit below 10,000 feet was 250 knots in Colombia as it was almost everywhere else. And this was the first of several comments by him that showed that he was relying on the captain's experience of this route. Which is worth remembering, because that fact might be the reason why the first officer was about to lose a little bit of his normal assertiveness. In any case, suddenly at time 21:36, the Cali approach controller called up Flight 965 and asked, "Sir, the wind is calm. Are you able to approach runway 19er?" And this was absolutely critical. So let's look at what this request actually meant. Runway 19 at Cali was served by a non-precision VOR DME approach that provided only lateral guidance, making it quite a bit more complex than the ILS approach to runway 01 that these pilots had already briefed. But because they would be able to approach runway 19 straight in without first having to fly all the way to the other side of the airport, accepting this request would potentially save quite a bit of time. Now, the procedure for this approach called for the crew to start at the Tulua VOR, which was the initial approach fix, and then to descend in pre-described steps down to the Rosso NDB, or final approach fix, before making the last bit of the descent down towards the runway. It also required the aircraft to be at an altitude of 5,000 feet by a point 21 nautical miles away from the Cali VOR DME, but since they were currently less than 60 miles away from Cali and still above 20,000 feet, this would mean that they would need a very steep descent in order to get down to that point in time. Nevertheless, as soon as the controller suggested it, the captain asked the first officer if he was happy with it, to which the first officer replied, "Yeah, we'll have to scramble to get down. We can do it." Now, the time spent making that decision was only about 4 seconds, which is really fast, likely too fast given the complexity of the decision. You see, not only were they very close and quite high, this also wasn't the approach that they had previously briefed, so it wasn't programmed into the FMC either. They didn't have the right charts out, they hadn't reviewed the minimum altitudes or navigational aids, missed approach procedure, or basically anything. So in order to fly this approach, they would now need to do everything that I just listed, plus cross-checking everything, recalculating the altitudes, speeds, descent profiles, and landing distance, whilst at that same time also executing and monitoring the descent, all whilst also keeping air traffic control in the loop. Now, there just wasn't enough time to do all of that unless they violated standard operating procedures by skipping some of the steps or asked for a holding, which would defeat the whole purpose of the shortcut. So why did they then agree to this in the first place? Well, looking back, it was probably a combination of several factors. First of all, it's not all that uncommon to plan for a longer approach only to be offered a shorter one if traffic is light or the weather allows it. And usually, there isn't much reason to turn these down, so the pilots would have been quite used to just accepting these type of offers. It's also worth keeping in mind that it was probably quite rare for them to get an offer like that after it was already too late to make the approach, since in most of the cases, they would have been flying in airspaces where the controller could see their position on radar and therefore would only make appropriate offers. And then on top of that, there was also that looming pressure of the cabin crew's rest time limits, which made this sudden offer of a shortcut seem like a great partial or potential solution to this problem. Then, the workload up until this point had also been very low. So while the pilots definitely knew that this straight-in approach would increase their workload, they might not have fully appreciated just how much it would go up. Now, in situations like this, unless you have pre-briefed for the potential of a runway change, it's almost always better to turn these type of offers down. A shortcut like this might save you 5 to 10 minutes in a best-case scenario, but it will also give you a multitude of new grey hairs for no particular reason, and no one will ever thank you for it. And that's quite good to remember, because it can be quite helpful when it comes to stopping the temptation of accepting risky shortcuts. But in this case, the pilots did accept it, knowing full well that they would have to scramble in order to achieve it, but likely underestimating the true difficulty of what they were now facing. In any case, immediately the first officer now started increasing the descent rate, and one of the pilots, likely also the first officer, deployed the speed brake to increase the drag. But nobody called that action out. The captain then told the controller that they would need a lower altitude right away, and the controller responded by clearing them for both the Rosso 1 arrival and the runway 19 VOR DME approach, which basically gave the pilots a blank check to descend all the way down to the minimum descent altitude. So it was now up to them. But the controller also added, again, that the crew needed to report to Lua, which the captain now failed to read back, so the controller repeated it again. The second time, the captain acknowledged it, and he then also told the first officer, "I gotta give you Tulua first of all. You wanna go right to to Tulua?" Sounding a little bit confused. And the first officer replied, I thought he said the Rosso 1 arrival? Now, do you remember how the captain had previously thought that they were clear direct to Cali, bypassing Tulua, and how the waypoints Tulua and Rosso had therefore disappeared from the navigation display? Well, now the captain was clearly caught off guard by the request to report Tulua, but once he realized that it wasn't on the display, he dove down into his CDU to try and put that waypoint back up again. And that was a distraction, right at the time when the pilots needed to be reviewing the approach chart to understand what they were about to do. And meanwhile, the first officer also didn't seem to have a mental picture of how Tulua related to the Rosso 1 arrival. Probably because they hadn't briefed it. But also because stars are usually named after their first waypoint, which in this case would be Tulua, but the Rosso 1 arrival was actually named after an intermediate waypoint. In response to the first officer's question, the captain said, "Yeah, he did. We have time to pull that out?" Likely referring to the star chart. Now, no one answered that, but the cockpit voice recorder did record the sound of rustling papers as the captain now started searching for the correct chart. It took him about 2 seconds to find it, and after examining it for a further 13 seconds, he said, "Yeah, see, that comes off Tulua." So with that confusion clarified, now all he needed to do was to get Tulua back on his display. But that's not what he ended up doing. Instead, he went back out on the radio and asked, "Can American 965 go direct to Rosso and then do the Rosso arrival, sir?" And that was a call that made absolutely no sense at all. You can't fly to Rosso and then do the Rosso 1 arrival because that star starts from Tulua, and Rosso was practically right next to the runway. Now, the captain's comment, "That comes off Tulua," would seem to show that he knew this, but if he did, why would he even make that type of a request? Well, without knowing exactly what he was looking at, it's impossible for us to speculate on, but he might have been referring to something else entirely and was still operating under the assumption that Rosso was the starting point of the Rosso 1 arrival. If that was the case, then he might have thought that getting a direct clearance to Rosso while skipping Tulua would reduce his workload by removing the need to program in that fix. But of course the controller had no idea why the pilots would want to do this, and he also didn't have the English language skills to explain why it made no sense, so he instead just repeated the original clearance to fly the Rosso 1 arrival and to land on runway 19. After the captain then read this back, the controller then also again requested that they report Tulua and the 21-mile point at 5,000 feet, which the captain also read back, but he was now starting to get more and more confused. The first officer asked if they were cleared down to 5,000 feet now, to which the captain replied, "That's right, and off Rosso, which shall tune here, see what I get." This seems to indicate that he still thought that the Rosso 1 arrival started from Rosso, but given that he had flown to Cali 13 times before, he should have known that this wasn't the case. Now, there is always the possibility that with the suddenly compressed time frame and lack of an appropriate briefing, he was starting to get names, locations and distances a little bit mixed up here. So the next thing that he tried was to bring the Rosso point up on their navigation display. And that would end up being the next big turning point in this story. You see, the way that pilots normally bring up nav aids from the FMS database is by keying in an identifier, basically a letter or group of letters corresponding to that navigational aid. For non-directional beacons like Rosso, the identifier was normally just one letter, So to differentiate them, the full name of each NDB in the database was stored as a string, starting with the identifier, then the CAO code for the country in which it was located, followed by its frequency. So in the case of Rosso, that identifier was just R, as in Romeo. But it turns out that in Colombia at the time, the government had given two different NDBs that same identifier, R, both of which were also broadcasting on the same frequency, 274 kHz. So this meant that the naming scheme used in the database couldn't differentiate them. And that therefore also meant that when Jeppesen, the same company that makes the approach chart, was developing this database, they had to use some kind of different protocol to differentiate beacons that fell into this edge category. And the way that they did this was by using this single letter identifier for whichever NDB that was located at a more important airport. And the less important NDB was then given a new identifier, which was just the full name of the beacon spelled out. And that was the case with Rosso. What this all meant was that, in this case, the approach chart showed that the Rosso NDB had the identifier R, but in the FMS database, this identifier corresponded to the Romeo NDB near Bogota. So in order to get Rosso into the route, the pilots would have had to type out Romeo, Oscar, Zulu, Oscar, Rosso. Now the captain would have likely never had encountered this before on his previous flights to Cali, since Rosso would have normally just been loaded into the pre-programmed approach or arrival procedure. So it was likely that he would have had no idea of this special case. And none of the pilots had received any specific Jeppesen training that covered these edge cases in the FMS logic. So this meant that what the captain was used to do was that he could just enter the one-letter identifier in the CDU, and then the closest beacon with that identifier would pop up at the very top of a drop-down list. And since 99% of the time the closest beacon was also the one he wanted, it had become almost muscle memory to just select the result from the top of that list and enter it in. Now, of course, standard operating procedures still required both pilots to cross-check that the correct beacon had been selected, but the captain was now rushing and also had loads of other tasks ahead of him. So he just typed in R, instinctively selected the first result and then pressed execute without cross-checking. Now, I don't think that he skipped that check consciously. Instead, that was likely happening here because of the increased workload. And because of that, the pilots probably instinctively started shedding certain tasks. And the tasks that normally get shed first are monitoring tasks like cross-checking and instrument scans, not active tasks like making autopilot selections or control inputs. But what all of this meant was that the captain now didn't realize that he had selected a beacon that was 132 nautical miles northeast of their position. And he also didn't look at his navigation display to see that the now magenta line was taking them into a more than a 90-degree left turn. Instead, he just told the first officer, 21 miles at 5,000 part of the approach. And he then started tuning the Tulua VOR frequency into one of the plane's VHF nav radios. Now, he probably wanted to do this so that he could report passing a beam Tulua as the controller had wanted, even though he had no intention of actually flying there. But as this was going on, and as the first officer was hastily reviewing the approach charts, neither pilots noticed that the autopilot was now executing that 90-degree left turn, even though the control columns and instruments were definitely moving right in front of their eyes. Now, it's really hard to understand how they could miss this, but we're sitting here with the benefit of seeing the whole picture and also going through everything step by step. In reality, only 2 minutes had passed since the controller had offered them to get runway 19, so it's worth keeping that in mind and just remembering just how much things that I have talked about since then. Also, remember that as the captain was now busy setting up frequencies and the first officer was studying the charts, it is not unthinkable that none of them were actively monitoring what the autopilot was doing as this happened. What's very clear though is that these pilots were trying to do a million different things, very quickly and all at once, and to illustrate just how that can affect things, I want you guys out there to now do one very important thing. And that's to count how many times these golf balls leave my hands as I juggle them. You ready? Go. Great. So, how many times was that? Now, did any one of you see anything else on the screen as that was going on? Go back and have a look. Anyway, in the middle of all of this, as the plane was turning, the controller also called up and asked for their distance from the Cali VOR. The captain glanced down at his DME indicator and quickly responded that they were now 38 miles out. 3 seconds later, possibly noticing that ongoing left turn, the first officer suddenly said, where are we going out to? And the captain replied, let's go right to Tulua, first of all, okay? But the first officer just added again, yeah, but where are we headed? Which is never a good sign when you are pilot flying. Now the captain started rechecking that he had entered the correct frequency for the Tulua VOR, but something clearly wasn't right here. So he now joined into the first officer's confusion. What happened here? The first officer now started to say, manual, possibly meaning that they should disengage the autopilot. But the captain instead interrupted him saying, let's come to the right a little bit. He might have been expecting a slight turn when he had selected Director Rosso, but he now likely felt that this was going too far and therefore wanted to break it off. But at that exact point, the plane stopped turning right, now heading almost due east, directly towards the high mountains northeast of Cali. But there was no sign on the cockpit voice recorder that the two pilots understood this. Instead, the captain remained occupied with the Tulua VOR, now telling the first officer that he would just put direct Tulua into the FMS. Both pilots then verified that Tulua had been entered and checked their navigation displays, with the first officer adding, yeah, it's a left turn. Now the navigation display would indeed have been showing a left turn to Tulua at this point, because unknown to the pilots, they had already passed it a couple of minutes earlier, so it was now behind them. But the captain had now started to fall far behind his aircraft, and in his mental model of the situation, Tulua should still be somewhere ahead of them, so this proposed left turn didn't look right to him at all. He therefore said, yeah, I gotta identify that sucker though. At which point the sound of Morse code beeps started being heard in the cockpit, spelling out Uniform Lima Quebec, the correct identifier for Tulua. You see, VOR beacons broadcast Morse code identifiers, so the captain was now using this to verify that he had tuned in the correct beacon, which he evidently had. He then added, okay, I'm getting it, 17.7. Just doesn't look right on mine. I don't know why. The first officer, however, took the FMS display at face value and again stated that they would need to make a left turn back around towards Tulua. But to that the captain just responded, nah, hell no. Let's press on to... Press on to where though? Interjected the first officer. Tulua, the captain again insisted, causing the conversation to come to a full confusing circle. Now, as you can probably see here, the pilots had now totally lost their position situational awareness. And the single most critical aspect of their situation was that they were now descending towards high terrain at a rate of more than 2,000 feet per minute, with the speed brakes still extended. In situations like this, what they therefore needed to do was to break off the descent immediately and then climb to their minimum sector altitude, and then try to figure out where they were and what they were going to do. But these two pilots never discussed that. Instead, they were still trying to figure out their position, referring to the Tulua and Rosso beacons, with their heads down in the CDU, fiddling around with the computer. Now, the final report contains a lot of information about why the pilots might not have considered the presence of the high terrain around them, like the fact that terrain counters were not depicted on the Jeppesen chart for Cali, or the fact that the captain had always flown to Cali during night, or the possibility that he had become accustomed to flying near mountains and therefore had become a little bit complacent. But I personally think that the most important factor here was likely fixation or attention tunneling. You see, both of these pilots were becoming completely occupied by the need to clear a perceived obstacle. In this case, whether the FMC was showing Tulua correctly or not, and that therefore came at the expense of all other considerations. The first officer was suggesting that they should trust the FMS, while the captain argued that they shouldn't, when in reality this was completely the wrong questions to ask. You see, while complex automation like the FMS normally reduces workload, it can, under certain conditions where events are unfolding rapidly and in a potentially dangerous direction, actually increase workload instead, which was exactly what was now happening. One way to put it, courtesy of American Airlines training captain Warren Vanderberg, is that you wouldn't try to program the FMS to try and avoid a mid-air collision, would you? Instead, you would just grab the controls and avoid the other plane, right? Well, we are taught that when a situation is spiraling like this one, the correct answer is often to reduce the level of automation, to go back to basics and just fly the airplane to safety. After all, as the golden rule of aviation states, aviate, navigate and communicate. And there, aviate still comes before navigate. But getting to that conclusion requires recognizing that the situation is becoming unsafe in the first place, which is the really hard part. Things like crew resource management, threat and error management and so on are great for making sure that you don't lose situational awareness in the first place, but once you have lost it, it can be super hard to get it back, or even to realize that you have lost it. Now, the transcripts from the CVR suggest that the first officer knew that something was wrong. Maybe he even felt that they should be doing something different from what the captain was suggesting. And if he had just said, "Hey, I don't like this, maybe we should just climb and follow the missed approach," well, then things might have ended very differently. But remember, while this was a very competent and experienced first officer who was normally perfectly assertive, he was currently in a position where he had become dependent on the captain to guide him through the descent into this complex airport in a country he had never flown to before. And that fact might have undermined his own confidence, whilst also increasing his confidence in the captain's, resulting in a breakdown in crew resource management. All of this combined meant that nobody therefore said the words that would have broken that spell of fixation. And Flight 965 instead just kept descending into the jaws of the Andes, hidden in the darkness and clouds ahead of them. In any case, the pilots now continued their confused discussion, as the first officer said Tulua was a right U-turn, to which the captain said, "Where are we going? Want to come to the right. Let's go to Cali first of all. We got suckered up here, didn't we?" Now here he came heartbreakingly close to realizing that they were lost and needed to exit the situation. But unfortunately, he still kept trying to fix it by using the FMS, which was actually the very thing that was causing all of these difficulties. He tried to input direct to the Cali VOR again, and he then told the first officer to come to the right now. By this point, though, the first officer had already used the autopilot's heading select mode to turn to the right, reversing the initial erroneous left turn and actually dropping a step in automation, which was the correct thing to do. But the problem was that none of them realized that they had now been flying east for a long time, long enough to cross over the closest mountain range, and by turning right, they would therefore need to cross back over those same mountains again, whilst still descending. This, by the way, is why climbing to the highest minimum sector altitude in situations like this is so important, because that will guarantee terrain clearance as you get your bearings back again. Now, completely unaware of this imminent danger, the captain went back on the radio and said, "American, 38 miles north of Cali, and you want us to go to Tulua and then do the Rosso to the runway, right? Runway 19? The controller now once again got the impression that something was weird here, because the pilots had reported being at 38 nautical miles over 2 minutes ago, and they now had just reported that same distance again. So how could they have flown for 2 full minutes without getting any closer to Cali? Unfortunately though, he didn't speak enough English to articulate this, so he just repeated that they were clear to land on runway 19 and again asked for the DME and altitude. And to that, the captain replied that they were at 37 DME and 10,000 feet. After this, the captain also told the first officer that they were in good shape now and headed in the right direction, presumably because he felt that they were correcting their previous error and were heading back, with the Cali VOR straight ahead on their FMS displays. He also then added, "You want to take the 19 yet?" indicating that he was now so comfortable with their corrections that they could start concentrating on the approach again. And the first officer just responded, "Okay." The captain now started going head down again into the CDU to try to program the runway 19 VOR approach. But just like before, he didn't seem to understand that Tulua was behind them, because he now said, "It's that sucking Tulua I'm not getting for some reason. See, I can't get it. Okay, now, no, Tulua suck it up, but I can't put it in the box. But I can put it in the box if you want it." The first officer replied, "I don't want Tulua. Let's go to the extended center line of, which is Rosso," the captain answered correctly. "Why don't you just go direct to Rosso then, okay?" But of course, going direct to Rosso was exactly what had gotten them into this situation in the first place. But the captain anyway announced that he was going to put Rosso into his CDU. And the first officer told him at the same time to reset their altimeters for the transition from standard to local pressure, since they were now descending through 10,000 feet. Meanwhile, in the control tower, the controller felt that something was really off with Flight 965, and after thinking about it for a minute, he came up with a way to verify it using his limited English. First, he asked for their altitude, to which the captain replied 9,000 feet. And he then asked their distance, hoping to check whether their altitude and distance matched up or whether they were maybe too low. But he never got a reply back, because at that exact moment, all hell suddenly broke loose in the cockpit. At time 21:41 and 15 seconds, the 757's ground proximity warning system detected an excessive closure rate with the ground directly beneath them. And that caused its automated voice to start blaring out, "Terrain, terrain, whoop whoop, pull up." Unfortunately, this was not a modern, enhanced GPWS, so it hadn't been able to detect that the plane had already been flying towards this mountain for over a minute. It could only sense that the mountainside was now rising up towards them. And this also meant that there was precious little time to do anything. But both pilots reacted almost immediately, with the first officer pulling sharply back on his control column and the captain pushing the thrust levels up to maximum thrust. But in the confusion, nobody remembered that the speed brakes were still deployed. Remember those? Probably not, right? In many airlines, it's policy to keep one hand on these speed brakes whenever they are in use, and that's done specifically to not forget that they are extended. But that wasn't the case at American Airlines back in 1995. And to make matters even worse, retracting the speed brakes wasn't part of the memory items for a terrain escape maneuver at the time either. Instead, those memory items just included applying toga thrust and to pull up until the stick shaker stall warning activated intermittently, and then to hold that attitude until you are clear of the terrain. The point of this procedure was, and still is, to try and extract maximum climb performance from the airplane, but of course, if the speed brakes are deployed when you do this, the performance will be severely degraded. Now, in the heat of the moment, with alarms blaring, as a pilot, you are probably going to fall back onto practice routines and memory items only, and in this case, that therefore meant that the extended speed brakes were completely forgotten. And that proved to be the last link in a long, horrible chain of events. Within seconds of the GPWS activating, the first officer had pulled back far enough to reach the stick shaker threshold, where if he kept pulling up, the aircraft would eventually stall. Now, this intermittent stick shaker precision represented the maximum possible climb that he could get, so in accordance with his training, he now tried to hold that pitch in a desperate attempt to avoid the mountain in front of him that he still couldn't see. As the GPWS continued to sound, the captain shouted words of encouragement like, "Pull up, baby," and "Easy does it, easy does it." But when the warning still didn't stop, he then desperately added, "More, more." With everything they had, they willed their aircraft to rise above the fog-shrouded summit, almost pleading with it to do it, but it just wasn't enough. Instead, near the remote village of El Diluvio, American Airlines Flight 965 finally ripped into the trees just below the top of a rugged mountain ridge. It sliced through the forest at an extreme nose-up angle as it fought and just barely failed to reach up into the pitch-black sky above. The final impact was extremely violent, sending debris tumbling up and then over the top of the ridge as only a few dozen feet had separated the aircraft from salvation. And tragically, if those speed brakes had been retracted, they almost certainly would have made it. But sadly, that just wasn't the case. At first, no one knew what had happened to Flight 965, and it took until the following morning for searchers to find the wreckage high up on the mountain slope northeast of Cali. The rescuers weren't expecting to find anyone alive, but when they arrived, they were greeted by the incredible sight of a person standing amid all of the wreckage, waving to them for help. After a harrowing rescue operation, the emergency crew were able to save just 4 passengers and 1 dog, who ended up being the only survivors out of 163 passengers and crew on board. Now, this accident quickly became a landmark case in aviation history, used to teach pilots around the world about topics like automation dependency, situational awareness, and CRM. And it also caused airlines and the Federal Aviation Administration to recognize the value of the enhanced ground proximity warning system, which was still just a prototype at the time, but which would have given this crew more than 3 times as much warning time of the impending impact. So within just a couple of years, the new eGPWS therefore became mandatory on all transport aircraft in the United States, and very soon after that, everywhere else in the world as well. This accident also directly led to the inclusion of speed brakes retracted as a memory item within the terrain escape maneuver, so that pilots will now instinctively reach for it and retract the speed brake the second the words "whoop whoop, pull up" are heard. And there was actually a recommendation to go even further, by requiring the speed brakes to retract automatically when max thrust is applied, since there is virtually no scenario where you want max thrust and speed brakes out at the same time. Many modern aircraft do have that feature, but still today it's not yet mandatory, and that means that some planes, like the Boeing 737 that I fly, still don't have it. So I think that this is an area where further improvements could still make flying even safer. But the thing about this accident that really sticks with me though is how it clearly shows that something like this can basically happen to anyone. These were 2 excellent pilots who flew their plane into a mountainside because they fell victim to a series of cognitive traps. Traps that don't discriminate based on number of flight hours or awards received. So the only way to ensure that we are resistant to those is by learning what they are, how to recognize them, and how to escape them. And most of all, by learning from the stories of those who didn't escape. That is the true reason why my team and I are creating these videos, and if you want to take part in our mission, then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. And then you will also get to see my next video before everyone else, maybe even today. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.